Welcome to the D-Shift podcast, where we provide inspiration, motivation, and education to help you transition from the challenges of divorce to discover the freedom and ability to live life on your own terms. Are you ready? Let's get this shift started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the D-Shift podcast. And today I am really excited to have somebody on the podcast that I met through Potapalooza, and she was gracious enough to interview me. And so I'm on her podcast. And the second I heard this lady's story, I knew that I had to have her come and talk to all of us on the D Shift. So I want to introduce you to Deborah Greenhut. She is the author of the novel, The Hoarder's Wife, which is based on her own life story. So Deborah took care of a lot of things in her life. And then at the age of 60, she went through a divorce. And now she has switched her focus in life to really help caregivers and those dealing with caring for other people to be able to build their resilience and deal with the challenges that this extra element of life adds to families. She has a Substack publication, and she's also the host of the podcast, The Caregiving Secret. So Deborah, welcome.
Thanks so much, Marty. It's great to be here with you this morning.
Yes, and it's so fantastic to have you. And before we get into all of the good nuggets of information you want to share with us about this, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Because it is one that I think is both unique, but also common to what a lot of people are going through.
Well, it's interesting you should ask. I think I was kind of a born caregiver. I was always worried about people who were unhappy or sad when I was a little girl, and always trying to take care of people. And my parents were a doctor and a nurse, so had a lot of indoctrination about how and why you should care for people very early. But unfortunately, fortunately, that helped me to decide I wanted to be a mom and I wanted to be a teacher, and I got a PhD in English so I could teach graduate school and help people to read better and all sorts of good things like that. But unfortunately, as it happens to many people, the caregiving part sometimes spills over too far and takes over your life. So that's a bit about my background. If you have any other specific questions, I'd be happy to go there.
No, I think that's a good background, because I think a lot of times how all the steps that we have in life, or all the experiences we've had in life, prepare us for what's coming up next. I know, it's interesting. I worked in a mental health facility for many years, and I had the opportunity to work with some of the patients on the brain injury unit. And I would always think, well, because I was a teacher, this really doesn't tie into my teaching or even my behavior consulting work. And lo and behold, I ended up dealing with a husband who had had a massive stroke and had a lot of neurological damage. And that work on the brain injury unit really prepared me for that. So, Deborah, let's talk about two different things on the podcast today. The first one I'd really like to talk about is that sense of what it's like to deal with a partner who has a mental health disorder, because that's very different. That's first, it's difficult, but second, it's different than being a caregiver for somebody who doesn't have a cognitive issue, but has more of a physical disability or an illness. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think we could come at that from a couple of different directions. For one thing, I can share that my husband suffered from hoarding disorder and ADHD, and he actually had about 10 different diagnoses. At 55, we finally discovered what had been causing a lot of the major malfunctions in our family. Although, as a family, I think we held together pretty well, which is a kind of peculiar consequence of what happened. But what happens, the difference and why it becomes more difficult, is that when there's a physical ailment, it's something that the plot line is you aspire toward a cure, or at least a better quality of life than you might have expected if you didn't intervene. So there's a clear plot line there of what people hope for, what everybody is working toward. When there's a cognitive issue, all bets are off in that department. We don't know what the person is capable of. We don't know where this is going. And often families are pushed to the side because therapist needs to focus on recovery. And sometimes that means, let's say, isolating the family from the person. And it gets a little bit sticky in terms of trying to preserve a quality of family life when you're arguing with a therapist about how dad is behaving. So that was the particular dilemma that we developed there. They said that they were going to rebuild my husband as a person, but they couldn't tell me who that person was going to be or how it was going to be for us. And there was a lot of conflict over that. And from talking with other people who've been through similar situations, that's a fairly good universal to prepare yourself for if you're going through it too.
Yeah. And I think if I can just interject too, and I'm certainly not the expert that you are, but the way that I would see too is a physical, my husband had a stroke. So it was very obvious. I mean, he couldn't walk. He was paralyzed on one side of his body, but it's much different when you have a mental health challenge because there's not a lot of visible symptoms. And that person may, for short periods of time, not exhibit any of the behaviors or the issues that the family sees when they're with them, over a prolonged period of time. And I just know a lot of my friends who have had family members or partners who have a mental health challenge or a mental health diagnosis, that they often really struggle because people just don't accept that they are in a caregiver role because it doesn't, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes that you meet them at the store, it doesn't appear that there's any challenges or any dependency issues there.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I had, I think, two major forces working against me and our family. I have two sons who are now in their 40s, but they were, living with this all along with me. And the first one was that when the diagnoses came in, the neuropsychiatrist told me I'd have to forget the last 20 years. It was the first 20 years of my marriage. And I said, well, how do I do that? Or what? On what basis are we still living in the same house together then? How do you navigate that? And they didn't have any answers for that, but that's, I guess, emotionally, they wanted me to give up on the idea that the person would ever be the same. And while it's realistic, it's also pretty cruel. And teenagers don't understand that kind of explanation. And why should they?
Yeah.
So that was one set of things. Another was that friends, family could not accept that we were going to have to live with behaviors for a while that might not be acceptable to them. Why don't you make him change? Why don't you tell him to stop? Were things I heard every single day of my life once we started the therapy, because he seemed to get louder in all the areas where we wished he would get softer. And, there's often a lot of contradiction that you have to deal with. And at least until fairly recently, there wasn't a corresponding therapy for the family to learn how to adapt or cope with it. So I think there were probably a lot more marital split ups, say 10, 20 years ago than there might be now. I think they recognize the family must be integrated in this therapy,
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about the impact on the family and specifically on the spouse. Yes, it's hard on the kids, and I think we do need to address that. But it's also really hard on the spouse dealing with this. And I'm thinking of how many people may be listening that are in this predicament, and maybe it's not their partner, but maybe it's a mother or a father that they're dealing with, that they're the caregivers. Can you talk a little bit about that, Deborah?
I think from my point of view, and I do hear this from other people, suddenly there's a values conflict. The way we've been doing things or what we agreed to when we got married is all out the window. Let's see if I can give you an example. Well, my husband was very careful with money, and I agreed. I thought that's the way we should be. But then suddenly he wasn't. And things like obeying the law or being a polite, kind person, those things went out the window. And one that involved my kids, which was particularly tricky, was suddenly my husband's driving deteriorated. And I don't mean cognitively. I mean, he just sped everywhere. And he started getting tickets everywhere. And my kids were in the early driving years. And I would ask the therapist, well, how do I explain to my kids that what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. How do I do that? It's hypocrisy, and they've been taught to call it out all their lives. My husband was a professor too, and now they can't say anything to him, but they're thinking, why should I care?
That's very true. And what about the children?
We taught them to look for the truth, to be honest people. And this hypocrisy, I think, was the biggest conflict of all, that suddenly Dad wasn't behaving the way he told everyone else to. And that was a huge rift, just a mental and emotional rift for our family, that this might never come back. And because their personalities and their ideals were still forming, they wondered, well, who are they supposed to be now? So it introduced a lot of, psychological conflicts into the family. I feel my kids were pretty rock solid about who they were, but they did not like this hypocrisy, and they did not know what to do about it. So, that may be coming in at an intellectual level, because our household was a lot of PhDs, let's say, and still is. But I think at an emotional level, this happens to everyone. If you're going to change this person, you need to bring everybody else into the program. Everybody needs to be on board somehow, or it's not a family anymore.
That's such a great explanation. Deborah, what about the experience? Like, what about the burnout symptoms and signs that you would encourage people who are a caregiver to kind of really keep an eye out for, or to be aware of?
I think for most of the first 20 years of my life, of my married life, I thought it was me. So I went to therapy. I kept trying to revise myself. And my therapist even said, who are you? Why aren't you trying to support that? And I want to be a better wife. I want to be a better me. Maybe if I'm a good enough person, these problems I have will go away. So one is the self-deception that you could fix it. And that is exhausting for caregivers. And whether it's a physical ailment or a cognitive ailment, I think the same thing happens. We speed up trying to help the other person, so we get over this hump of illness or confusion that we think we can make go away. So we take on too much. And so psychological burnout happens pretty quickly, followed by maybe physical burnout from trying to do too much, or staying up all night trying to figure out something that has no answer yet.
And I think the other thing too, I know from my experience, is you sort of have this sense that you have to do it. Like, I never felt that the hired caregiver would be doing it right. So I might as well just do it myself. And so we take on all of that extra work. Do you find that that's something that you hear your clients talk about?
Absolutely. It's kind of like wife times two if it's in a family situation. And I also know some professional caregivers who do the same thing, though. They think they can take over everything for the family, and maybe the family still wants to be engaged in it. So it's a very tricky balance throughout that industry, or throughout the calling to be there for your loved one, which is so important. You don't want to give it up entirely, but finding the right balance is really critical. And most of the people I see are at their wits' end, and also at their emotional and physical end. I can't do it anymore. I'm overwhelmed. So we know that is a problem.
Yeah, and I'm curious too about the idea of the trauma of having the responsibility for another person, whether it's because you have to get them to appointments, or whether it's because you're not sure, if you're dealing with a parent with dementia, or Alzheimer's, are they wandering out at night and they're getting lost? What about that mental stuff that's going on? Like, how do you see that impact all of your life?
Well, I'm thinking about that. I did blessedly find a partner, and for about 2 years we had a wonderful life together, and then it was discovered that he was exhibiting the early signs of Alzheimer's. And suddenly I had 14 different doctors to go to, trying to encourage this person to keep eating, handling many hygienic and other functions that I wasn't expecting. And I ended up more invasively involved in this person's life than I ever expected to be, because I loved him, because I cared about him. And I think that's where the trauma comes from, those usual boundaries between two adults. And they're good boundaries, healthy boundaries to have, where you're not enmeshed with someone else. That all dissolves. And the trauma comes from possibly not being appreciated or welcome with your intrusions, but they're necessary at the same time in order to be a caregiver. And yet doing this 24/7 is chaotic and not good for you. The easiest way to say it. It's just not good for you.
So I'm going to ask you about something that may be a little bit delicate, and you don't have to answer this at all. But I have worked with clients who are very concerned about leaving a marriage because their partner has some dependency level on them, whether it's a physical, mental, emotional, maybe they've got an alcoholism problem or an addiction problem. And there's a lot of guilt sometimes in leaving those kind of relationships. And I'm not asking you to, share your deepest secrets or anything, but would you feel comfortable talking a little bit along how people could maybe really take a better or clearer look about whether that's the right decision for them or not?
Well, I stayed married for 35 years, and we hit the diagnoses at the point when it was 20 years. So there were 15 years of really deteriorating circumstances where I tried to convince myself I needed to go, and I couldn't make the leap. So yes, I've been in that situation, and I don't mind talking about it now, because at the point where we found a therapist for my husband, I was behind the scenes, let's say. There aren't a lot of words for the camouflage that was in there, but he couldn't manage his checkbook. He could not find his bills. He could not find anything. So I had to be there watching from the sidelines and giving gentle suggestions. Well, it's probably time to pay the credit card bill, or time to look at the bank balance. But he didn't want to acknowledge that I had any role in this, because he was in charge and everything was under control. And we fought that battle for a long time. So you do have a lot of financial, emotional, mental, and physical responsibilities in a situation like that, but it's unacknowledged. And they often call cognitive caregivers hidden caregivers, because you can't make the person feel bad about what is happening. So I was angry. For 15 years, I was angry. I can't tell you how angry, once I started to understand what was happening, but I couldn't go. And it was the day that my husband's anger boiled over at me for something that he imagined had happened, that I said to myself, I'm not angry anymore. This is not what I want. I have to go. So my question, and actually my husband gave me this question in a dispute about something I wanted to buy once. He said, do you want what you have? And until that 35 years had passed, I couldn't say, nope, I'm done.
Thank you. And I totally get where that's coming from, because there was, when my husband had his stroke, I mean, I was married to him for about 8 years, and then he had his stroke, and then I was his caregiver for 7 years before he passed away. So I was his wife about the same amount of time as I was his caregiver. And it's a very different role. Like it's not like you're the wife and the caregiver. At least I wasn't, because of the extreme issues. And it sounds like yours was similar. But one of the things that I found is I didn't want to acknowledge that resentment. But every time I couldn't just go to the grocery store when I wanted, or, if a friend called and said, or if I had an opportunity to get work and I had to travel, I had to turn down everything. And I was upset. And it took a while to acknowledge that it's okay to be angry in these situations, but it's also, you don't have to stay stuck in them, because there are alternatives. There are support systems. There are, if you're divorcing somebody that has chronic health issues, they would have to deal with it. If heaven forbid you passed away, something would have had to been done, right? You're not the only person on the planet that can deal with this. And sometimes acknowledging that is the first step in being able to see clearly whether staying or going is the right option.
Yeah, I think I didn't mention, both my husband and I were diagnosed with diabetes type 2 around the same time. And my solution was to go out and read everything I possibly could to figure out how to manage this and not fall into the traps that so many of us do. And his solution was to do nothing. And that alone made me very angry. And I thought, how could you do this to our kids? Don't you want to see your grandchildren? It didn't make any sense to me. But that was another part of the things I had to tolerate, and thinking I could fix that. I could teach him what he needed to know, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
And you have to, at a certain point, people do need to find other ways to take care of themselves, to be responsible adults. I was a little nervous when I went for the divorce that they might decide that he needed my care and that I shouldn't be leaving him, that there would be something, I don't know. I imagined all sorts of reasons why they wouldn't let me get a divorce. But fortunately, the judge looked at the case, and my husband never appeared for any of the court appearances. He ignored the whole thing, didn't answer any of the lawyers' letters. So the judge said, that's it. You do these things and you're getting a divorce, and there's no question about it. So that wasn't what I was anticipating. I really thought it wouldn't go well. But you might be surprised. There are a lot of wise people making those divorce decisions. So you may have a lot more power and a lot more on the side. You might be a lot more on the side of right than you imagine.
Right. Yeah. And again, we're not advocating that if a partner has some kind of health or mental health problem, that divorce should be the consideration. But sometimes these relationships are simply not sustainable. It's interesting, when Eddie had his stroke, there was also another person on the stroke unit with him. And when this gentleman had his stroke, his personality did a complete 180, and he became a very violent individual, where he would strike out at the nursing staff, at his spouse, at his children. And they were teens, so they were old enough to kind of understand what was going on. But still, he became very verbally abusive towards people. And, it became, I'm not laughing at it, but it became so bad that they couldn't even find an assisted living or nursing home facility that would take him if he wasn't sedated, because he was that aggressive. And because of the stroke, medications don't always work the same way on the brain. And so it was really tough for them for a long time. And she finally did decide to leave him. But she went through so much agony, because that was not the person he was at all. And she was still remembering the pre-stroke personality as opposed to. So there's all these things you have to think about.
Right. I'm not advocating for divorce as the solution. I came to a place where I didn't want to live that way anymore.
For you. So, yes. And I think that's the thing, is this has to be an individualized decision, and it has to be done from a place of understanding and clarity, but also empathy for your kids, for yourself, and for your partner, because there's a lot of moving parts when you're dealing with any kind of additional challenges to a divorce. Deborah, we were almost out of time, but I do want to ask you one quick question. When you're talking to caregivers who are facing burnout, or who already say, I can't do this anymore, I've had it, and their physical health, their emotional health is starting to go into the tank because of it, what are a couple of recommendations that you give people?
Well, the best time to plan for caregiving is before you agree that this is going to be your life. That's number one. But generally people don't. I try to advise that, but people don't always listen. But what I do is ask people I have 4 quadrants: financial, emotional, mental, and physical. And I say, on a scale of 0 to 10 for each one, and 10 is the most satisfied, where are your dissatisfactions occurring? Because that's the area, the one that has the highest score, where you've got to do something immediately to start lowering the stress. So if you're not seeing any friends anymore, and that's leading to emotional and physical, possibly complications, take an action there. At least start somewhere, so you can start digging out from the hole that you're in. And many people say, I can't afford help. Well, counties have a lot of help available typically, at least now they do. And I hope that will continue, because you can't do it alone. People make the mistake of thinking, I can do this all by myself. And the fact is, most of us can't.
You have to be the squeaky wheel.
Your own squeaky wheel. Yes.
Deborah, tell us a little bit about, well, actually, let's go right to this question. What, of all the things you've talked about, what do you think is the most important?
I think the recognition that if you're working on this 24 hours a day, you need to pull back and evaluate that. Even if everything seems to be fine, it's probably not, because no one can do that kind of concentration on another 24 hours a day. So I would start there. How many hours a day are you spending? And if you're too tired, can you cut back 30 minutes? Can you, try to chip away at that? But you can't do it alone. I think that's the most important thing, and we all need to recognize that.
How can people get a hold of you? And thank you for that information.
Oh, sure. My website is www.deborahgreenhut.com. So just deborahgreenhut.com. And that's the easiest way. I think I have a contact form on the website, and you can use that.
And Deborah has provided a gift. Can you tell us a little bit about that one? It is a free session with you, a complimentary session with you.
Absolutely. If you fill in the contact form and ask for it, that's all you need to do. So please go to my website and fill in the contact form and tell me you'd like to have a complimentary session to evaluate where you are in caregiving or what you need to do to get to a better place.
Deborah, thank you so much for being here today and sharing this information. And if people are listening and they're in this situation, reach out to Deborah. She's really got a heart and a lot of expertise and experience in this. Deborah, thank you so much for being here today. And I'd like to thank everybody for listening into the D Shift. And don't forget to tune in again next week.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening and supporting the D Shift podcast. If you would like to attend live trainings by our amazing guests and have a chance to ask questions and get answers from our experts, join the D Shift crew. For more details and to sign up, head on over to www.divorcecoachforwomen and click on the podcast page.